Thank you so much for joining us for this side event today. My name is Himanshu Dixit. I'm from India, from Council on Energy, Environment and Water. A very warm welcome to you who are showing interest in cooling. We just want to start with a video story from India, which will show you how access to sustainable cooling has the potential to transform lives and livelihoods. And it's happening on the ground in India. So I'll request to please play the movie. Thank you.
आज यहाँ पे 200 महिलाएं इकट्ठी हुई। ये महिलाएं अपनी आजीविका कैसे बढ़ानी है उसके बारे में आज इन्होंने समझा है, तो उनका प्रोत्साहन बढ़ता है। ये पावरिंग लाइवलीहुड वाले जो प्रोग्राम अरेंज करते हैं वो हर बार अरेंज करें ताकि महिलाएं और खुल के बाहर आए और सबको जाके बताएं। नमस्ते, मेरा नाम गायत्री सुथार है। मैं उदयपुर डिस्ट्रिक्ट के झाड़ोल ब्लॉक से गोदाना गांव से हूँ। मेरी शादी गुजरात से राजस्थान में, वहाँ से शादी होके यहाँ पे आई, ना किसी को जानना ना पहचान। पहले जो काम कर रही थी मैं महिलाओं के साथ सिलाई का काम करना, पार्लर का काम करना, आंगनवाड़ी में पोशार पहुँचाने का, यहाँ पे आके एकदम से बैठ गई थी। मेरी पढ़ाई कर रखी थी मैंने एमए, बट सारा वेस्ट था उस टाइम में। मैं मेरे समूह के माध्यम से, आजीविका के माध्यम से मैं मेरे घर से बाहर निकली। उसके बाद हमने सभी महिलाओं ने इकट्ठी होके, हमारे यहाँ बहुत सारी बकरियाँ थी, हमने तय किया कि हम सारा बकरियों का जो दूध होता है वो एक जगह पे इकट्ठा करेंगे। उसके बाद हम उसको जो हमारे दूध सेंटर चलता है बागपुरा में, वहाँ पहुँचाएंगे। बट हमको बहुत सारी समस्याएं भी आती है क्योंकि हमारे यहाँ पे लाइट की असुविधा रहती है, कटौती इतनी रहती है सुबह से शाम तक। वो दूध तो इकट्ठा कर रहे हैं, वो फ्रिज में रख रहे हैं, तो लाइटें नहीं है तो ठंडा होता ही नहीं है, और कम से कम 1-1.5 घंटा दूध को ठंडा करना पड़ता है, तब जाके बाहर बेच सकते हैं। तो दूध धीरे धीरे वापस बंद करने लगे क्योंकि पैसा आता ही नहीं था। बट हम फिर वीओ की मीटिंग में गए, वहाँ पे हमारे सर आए एक, उन्होंने हमको डीडी सोलार के बारे में बताया। बिना लाइट के चलने वाली चीज़ है। तो हमने वो फ्रिज लिया और हम हमारे समूह में उस फ्रिज का यूज़ कर रहे हैं। इस फ्रिज की वजह से हमको जो बेनिफिट हो रहा है वो सारा हमारे समूह में रहता है। दूध जाता है, दूध का कलेक्शन करते हैं हम, दूसरी जगह पे हम बेचते हैं और वापस वहाँ से टाइम से पैसा भी आ जाता है और दूध फटने की कोई टेंशन नहीं होती।
ये बहुत अच्छी स्कीम है। कृपया ये सोलर रेफ्रिजरेटर जरूर लगाएं। दूध, दही, मक्खन, पनीर, लस्सी वो सारा स्टोर कर पाएंगे। आपको खराब होने की चिंता नहीं रहेगी, आपको बिजली के बिल की चिंता नहीं रहेगी।
At Powering Livelihoods, we identified value chains that employ a lot of women working in areas that face a lot of power supply challenges. As a next step, we wanted to inform the women about the ability of DRE livelihood technologies to improve their livelihood practices. Through hyperlocal events, we wanted to support clean energy technologies to reach women's doorstep directly without having to wait for them to discover it. At these events, women are provided product demonstration videos and information on subsidies and financing available to buy these products. Other women DRE users also come and share their experience to increase the buyer's confidence. We wanted to create avenues where women can touch, feel and understand the product benefits better.
पावरिंग लाइवलीहुड वालों ने अपन को इतना सपोर्ट किया है, आज इतना बड़ा अपने लिए इन्होंने प्रोग्राम जो किया है, इनकी वजह से आज हमारी महिलाएं आजीविका की ओर बढ़ रही है। जो सब्सिडी मिल रही है उसका हमको पूरी तरह से फ़ायदा लेना है। आज एक लिया है फ्रिज तो कल 2 लेंगी, 4 लेंगी। उस हिसाब से स्टेप बाय स्टेप बढ़ेंगे और अपना रोजगार और बढ़ाएंगे। मैं यही चाहती हूँ कि मैं जैसे आगे बढ़ी हूँ वैसे मेरी और भी महिलाएं आगे बढ़े।
So refrigeration is just one dimension of cooling. There are many other dimensions. And to get into all of that, we are going to start with a panel discussion. And we have a stellar panel with us today to discuss all these issues. So let me invite Avispa Mahapatra, who is a director of campaigns and advocacy, and she has about at Environmental Investigation Agency based out of the United States, and she has more than 10 years of experience in cooling. Avispa, please come and introduce the panel, please. Thank you. Up to you.
Everyone, I'm hoping that you can hear me here. Great. It feels very ceremonial to do this, thank you. And it's my great pleasure to be in this very learned and very diverse panel. So without talking too much about myself or further ado, I would really like to invite on stage Ms. Hannah, who's the CEO from Forum for the Future, and Philip Denzinger from GIZ. And we have one more panelist, Helen Ternoni, from the Technology and Economic Assessment Panel of the Montreal Protocol, who is, I think, trying to find this venue and should be here quick enough. I'm only joking. She's on another panel at another event. And then I also want to invite Vaibhav Chaturvedi from CEEW, Himanshu's colleague. And I would just start by saying that as Himanshu very unkindly aged me already, I have been working in the Montreal Protocol world for more than a decade. And albeit it is often called the most successful environmental agreement in the world, if we take a step back and look at what the Montreal Protocol does, is that as a treaty, it was very much designed to protect the ozone layer, but the way in which it protects the ozone layer is by ensuring we are stopping production of specific refrigerants, and then that facilitates transition to different refrigerants. But what we have seen over the last 30 plus years of the Montreal Protocol is that has led to this treadmill of chemicals. We're just going from one chemical, CFCs, to 8 CFCs, to HFCs. Oops, that was really bad for the ozone. Then we went to something that is okay for the ozone, not great for the climate. Then we all ended up with HFCs, which are definitely not great for the climate. And then in 2016, the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol was agreed to phase down HFCs around the world. So while, yes, that is a great success, what we have seen in the Montreal Protocol world is that we are still thinking in this 100-year-old concept of piping refrigerant through through this vapor compression challenge. And that is not the only way you need to cool. And that is not the only cooling challenge we have. So I'm very pleased to be here today, especially that the movie that we just watched allowed us to really center ourselves to the core question of what we are talking about. Who are we cooling? Why is cooling needed? And it is more than the refrigerants. It's about people. And with that, I think that's a great segue to start with the panel. And in the beginning, my first question to the panel is going to be, please introduce yourself in 1 or 2 sentences. And I will start with you, Hannah. And maybe while you're introducing yourself, I would love to hear what do you think is the opportunity and lesson here for us from a people-centered perspective? Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Lovely to be here with you all. I'm Mahapatra. I'm the International Managing Director at Forum for the Future. And Forum for the Future works with CEEW on the Responsible Energy Initiative. Really great to be representing the partnership here. And Forum works using systems change, so trying to understand problems and their complexity. So to bring that to this one, and I'm absolutely not a cooling tech person, so don't ask me complicated technological questions. But just thinking about like the why of why do we need cooling, with extreme heat I saw an estimate that India towards the latter part of the century may experience 200 days a year over 40 degrees, so over that sort of extreme heat threshold. And so what that means is the impact on people is really incredibly significant. So cooling is needed. Obviously, we need to be thinking about the technological solutions for that. But one of my areas of interests is climate adaptation, and specifically around the sort of socioeconomic aspects. Quite often when we talk about adaptation, we're really talking about technological pieces, so the built environment, for example. But actually, adaptation is made up of, yes, the built environment and technological solutions as well, but also the natural environment and how we integrate that, but then also the human element as well. So what are the socioeconomic resilience factors that can be built up? And that's things like improving literacy, it's reducing poverty, it's increasing gender equality. And this is where cooling is one of those dimensions, because it's such an enabler, as the video showed, of those livelihood dimensions, people being able to access and stay in education, even in those extreme heat days. So I guess from my perspective, thinking about this from a systems change lens, is thinking about what is the point of cooling? If we're talking about this, what does it serve from a human needs perspective, and how we build together those technological approaches with the more human approaches as well.
Thank you, Hannah. And talking about technological approaches, we have the right panelist to the left of me, which is a great segue to Philip, who has pretty much done different types of technology all across the world, but I'm stealing your thunder. So Philip, please introduce yourself, and I would love your initial thoughts on this connection between technology and people.
Yeah, thanks a lot. My name is Philip Densing. I work for GIZ ProClima for a decade now, into promoting green cooling, natural cooling in terms of using natural refrigerants, but also natural blowing agents, combining it with renewable energies. And yeah, from a technology perspective, there is technology available that's sustainable, that doesn't harm the climate, the ozone layer, or has any negative impacts on the environment when we talk about the HFOs, which you did not mention. And I think looking at the newer substances that are coming, they have severe consequences for the nature, for the biodiversity, for human health, and so on, and we have to be very careful. And therefore, we promote natural refrigerants, technology that is sustainable. The whole cooling started with natural refrigerants, and we know it's the ultimate solution, and therefore, yes, then access to cooling is a human right, and the technology is there, the sustainable one. But we need to make sure that people have access to the technology. We need economies of scale. And I mean, there is a lot of innovation that's available, and I think we will talk more about different types of technologies that would allow access to cooling globally.
Thank you. Yes, we already are sort of teasing ourselves into the next part of this conversation. But we've already covered sort of the bigger context and the technology part, and that's a great segue to introduce Vaibhav, who has, from his technical background, been involved in the policy part. And I want to make sure that we're covering sort of all aspects in this conversation. So Vaibhav, as you introduce yourself, I would love to hear a little bit more about CEEW's involvement in the biggest sort of cooling-related policy making in India, the India Cooling Action Plan, and then we will definitely get into more lessons and challenges later in the conversation.
Great. Thank you. Very good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. I'm Vaibhav. A bit about CEEW. We are a think tank, Asia's one of the leading think tanks on the climate space. We work across many different areas of work, be it air quality, industrial sustainability, climate risks, energy scenarios, a lot of different kinds of stuff we do. So I originally come from the climate space. So this is COP. This is like the larger climate debate. Then I moved to the Montreal Protocol space, where I worked a lot on cooling and HFCs and that kind of stuff. And now I'm back in the climate space. I'm very happy this conversation is happening on this forum, because there are very clear kind of linkages between the two. And that's where the role of policies and these kind of multilateral negotiations kind of become very important. Now coming to this, the ICAP. So many colleagues here might know that India has something called the India Cooling Action Plan. It's kind of an umbrella document that the important part is it's called action plan. It's not a policy, another policy document. So it's got very specific targets, and in terms of implementation. So right now we are implementing the ICAP, and where there are different ministries and departments who are in charge of various aspects of the ICAP, and there is very clear monitoring of progress that is happening. So it's an action plan. That's the first thing I want to talk about. But what does what is the ICAP all about, right? So the first thing that ICAP says is that the way it frames cooling is very interesting. So India is a developing economy, like low-income developing economy. So cooling traditionally was looked as a luxury commodity, right? So who owns an AC? Very few people own an air conditioner in India. Right now, the latest data said only 7% of households own an AC in India. That is bizarre, right? And a geography that is so hot, only 7% households own an AC, because it is expensive, right, given the average incomes in India. So it is always looked as a luxury commodity. The ICAP says, no, it's thermal comfort. So we need cooling for thermal comfort. The moment you change that framing, now that's why we start talking about access to cooling. So it's not just about people who can purchase, ACs. Everybody should have cooling, because it is a matter of thermal comfort. It's a matter of, kind of human life comfort and productivity also. So now we are also talking about so many laborers who are kind of employed in many factories where it's very hot for them to work, especially when temperatures soar. They also should be needing cooling. So the framing kind of changes a lot of stuff, the way we look at cooling in India, and ICAP kind of frames it in this way. The second thing it does, it is demand assessment. So it says, looking in the next 20, 25 years, how is cooling expected to grow? Because it is one of the fastest growing sectors, expected to grow significantly in India. And why it matters? Because cooling is the biggest part of our residential and commercial energy demand. Right? Not just electricity, energy demand, cooling is the biggest, it's fastest growing. And that really matters from the climate perspective, because the grid is also heavily fossilized. The grid is also heavily fossilized. So that growth is very important, and that's why we want to understand the demand of ACs, plus also more importantly, the electricity demand. The load curves are changing very fast. How do we manage this such a fast-growing sector? So that is what the ICAP kind of talks about, demand assessment. Then it talks about technologies, and not just traditional AC technologies. It talks about new technologies like district cooling, which India has really only very recently started experimenting with. Much more efficient technology, so a lot of different kinds of technologies it talks about. Then a very important theme throughout the ICAP is energy efficiency. So energy efficiency is a big resource. When you have such a fast growth in air conditioning demand, well, how do you save electricity? Through energy efficiency. The government of India has also followed up with some very important programs on standards, appliances and labeling, which looks at there's significant leaps in energy efficiency on that front. So now that is all tied on to the ICAP debate. Then of course refrigerant, because it is not just carbon we are talking about, which is the COP kind of platform. The refrigerant comes from the Montreal Protocol platform, right? So refrigerant transition is an important. So we don't want ACs with high GWP refrigerant. We want air conditioners with low GWP refrigerant. So that is another element in the ICAP, the refrigerant transition. Then a very interesting element where CEEW has done a lot of work is what we call the human face of the ICAP. So what is the human face of the ICAP? So it is essentially servicing sector, right? There's so many, like literally, I think around 1 million workers engaged in the servicing, installation and servicing of these air conditioners. And just imagine if the air conditioner penetration is going to grow 10 times. This workforce also is going to explode, right? And a lot of it is actually informal sector. They are kind of poorly trained. Those systems are not there in place, because it's a nature of any developing economy. So now what do we do with these service technicians? How do we train them? How do we ensure that their livelihood augmentation happens in the way we want as a society? So that's a very important element of the whole service, the ICAP. So thinking about these people who provide servicing for the air conditioners, thinking about the livelihoods, the important component. The final two things, one is research and development. Innovation is important. Innovation not just in terms of molecules of low GWP refrigerant. Innovation even in terms of business models. I think that is very interesting. In many of these fast-growing developing economies, it's innovation on the business models will actually help penetration of a lot of things, right? Help driving that. So business models and technology kind of innovation. And finally, it's also looked at the growth sector, right? So very limited value addition happens in India or in the air conditioner. A lot of air conditioners are actually imported from China. We don't want that to happen. A lot of value addition should happen in India because that's where growth comes from. So that is also kind of an important perspective that manufacturing should happen within India's economy, and India has followed up with very interesting kind of policies to pool in a lot of investment through its schemes and all that, so that manufacturing, to the extent possible, continues to kind of shift to India, right? So those are some very important elements of ICAP process in India. Thank you.
Thanks, Vaibhav, for walking us through the basis of what drove ICAP and what are the different elements. And maybe I'll take a step back for those in the room who are not as, nerded up on all of the cooling details as some of us might be, and think about why are we talking about cooling and why are we, I mentioned the Kigali Amendment before, why are we talking about that? As Vaibhav mentioned, sort of the connection between the Montreal Protocol and the climate treaty, I think it's important to just remind ourselves that the Kigali Amendment, if implemented properly, could save us 0.5 degree Celsius of warming, and that's tremendous. And if we see what does that mean, what does a proper implementation mean, it means making sure we are getting out of refrigerants or cooling technology that is causing warming. And that means making technology choices that are as climate friendly as possible. And that could mean different things, as you said before. It's not just refrigerant, it's energy efficiency, it's also the models that we are using, the business models that we are using. I will just say a quick refrigerant story that is the only thing that keeps me from killing dinner parties when I talk about refrigerants, is that the way, some of you might be wondering, why is the Environmental Investigation Agency here talking about refrigerants? So as the Environmental Investigation Agency, we investigate crimes against nature and climate. And one of the ways that we got into this space was back in the 1990s when CFCs were banned in the developed countries, but were still allowed in developing countries, as is the Montreal Protocol way of doing things. One of the reasons it's so successful is because developed countries go first and developing countries follow after a few years. What we saw back in the 90s in the US-Mexico border, that cans of CFCs that were getting smuggled across the US-Mexico border were as lucrative in their street value as cocaine, and less risky to smuggle. So there is value in how we build these models, and there is a legal trade, and there are all kinds of things which also kind of lead us to opportunities to not repeat the mistakes of the past. And I know that Philip is very eager to talk about some of the mistakes of our past and how we can possibly resolve them as a global community. So Philip, I know I didn't let you give you the opening last time, but now the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I believe, the technologies are there for most of the subsectors. And what we need to make sure is that they are accessible, especially in the global south. We can see that the global south doesn't get the best equipment like we do in Europe when it comes to energy efficiency, when it comes to quality. We have high certification criteria, and this doesn't apply always for the global south. And so they're getting more inefficient equipment with old refrigerants, as you mentioned. So they still are installing R22, although we know R22 HCFC is phased out up to the year 2030 globally. And so we need to make sure that the global south isn't losing out on technology, that they have access to it, that it's affordable, that it's efficient, that's innovative, that's on a quite high quality level, and that's sustainable using efficient and sustainable green refrigerants, natural ones. And then we need to make sure that we have enough innovation, that we also use digitalization, that we use different financing models, that we use different technologies when it comes to, we need to think that a lot of, what is happening now is that although urban areas are growing, access to energy is still an issue in the global south. And we are talking about that in many countries of the global south, the rural population doesn't have any access. And I mean, it was fine. I just went to Kenya this year again twice, and it was winter, and it had 30 degrees. And they told us this is not normal. And now, I mean, in the past you could have your vegetables at the market without cooling, but now a few degrees Celsius is destroying the vegetables at the market within a few hours. So even there we need to adapt, and we have a lot, we lose a lot of food. We need to feed another 1 billion of people that doesn't have access to cooling yet. And so we have a lot of food losses, food waste, and a lot of methane. So we have the 0.5 degrees avoidance of green cooling under the Kigali Amendment. But then if we look at the methane-related emissions and we count them again into the whole picture, then we're talking maybe about 1 degree Celsius. Huh? So there's more potential. The 0.4, 0.5 under Kigali, that's a more, let's say, conservative scenario. We are still continuing up to 2047, although we know the technology is there. How can that be? I mean, we're still waiting another 20, 30 years. And this is the ridiculous part. We want to fight climate change, but we look at refrigerants in 100 years perspective, although the GWP in 20 years is much more intense. I mean, if 1 kilo in one air conditioner has up to 5 tons of CO2 equivalent. So 1 kilo in one AC is 5 tons. I can fly twice to Europe and back from India, or at least. And I mean, and then we have leakages every year because the technicians, we need to make sure we have the technology, we need to make sure we have the skills. And this is green jobs and green skills. You have to stop me when I'm... So the refrigeration and air conditioning technician is one of the future jobs. And then we need to make sure they're properly skilled. So green skills and green jobs. And so this one refrigeration air conditioner technician can mitigate in 1 year, avoid hundreds of tons or thousands of tons of CO2 equivalent.
I'll take it
yes.
from you, and I'll give a little bit of context. Again, just to set the context a little bit. So Montreal Protocol as a treaty, and we keep going back to it because, again, not only is it the most successful treaty, but that is sort of the domain in which cooling technologies have been discussed for the last 30 years. That's why I keep going back to it. And what it does is it controls production. So it turns off the tap. That is its key goal. But what Philip is talking about and what Vaibhav already touched upon is what happens to the coolants once they're in a system. So yes, you might start turning off the tap, but there is already a bunch of equipment out there, almost like Easter eggs all around the world, with massive climate opportunities sitting out there. And as a global community, we haven't figured out a way to deal with that climate opportunity. And we've, this is a great plug for our report, which is a 90 billion ton climate opportunity, as we found in a joint report with EIA, NRDC, and IGSD. So that's massive, and that is, above what we are talking about through the Kigali Amendment. But the second part of it is it's not just, climate tonnage numbers. As Philip said, it's a people question as well. I don't think anyone really sees AC technicians as climate warriors. But what he's saying is that every technician can, in one air conditioner, affect 5 tons of CO2e. So I think that sort of brings me to Hannah as to sort of talk about how have the people sort of at the end of the chain, the real, boots on the ground and their work in mitigation and adaptation, how has that been, you think, historically looked at, and what kind of change, maybe in perspective and in policy, we need as we go forward?
Yeah, great question. So I work across a sort of number of different sort of sustainability issues. I'm always kind of a generalist, jack of all trades, if you like. But there are some really consistent themes that come up every time. And firstly is that our economic system is very poor at distributing kind of risk and reward in the system. So very often those at the end of the chain, whether that's farmers, whether that is people who are kind of at the service end of specific products, whether that's like the women in the video that we saw, they're often having to bear the risk of these transitions, whereas actually the benefit of those transitions actually benefits all of us from a climate change perspective. So there's something kind of quite macro about how risk and reward are distributed in the system, and that actually we need to be looking at the opportunities that are created, like you said, the 90 billion tonne opportunity, and how is that financed? Because actually it's for the kind of general collective benefit to finance that, but actually often those folks at the end of the chain find it particularly hard to access that finance. They might not have good credit, they might not have access to banking, they may not have the kind of literacy levels to be able to do that. So that's a critical shift that needs to happen. The other dimension that I often see popping up, whether it's sort of across agriculture or energy systems, is that the kind of connected nature of things gets lost. So when you're talking about, a very particular chemical, for example, we lose the why behind it, and we kind of focus in on that. Whereas actually the why, if you take a step back, is to kind of, it enables human activity, but it enables human activity in a way that's ecologically safe. So I think the other thing that I sort of call for is this kind of systemic interconnected approach, because then that helps us to see these like nodes of opportunity that then means that if we're looking at it in that way, we can decide where to encourage the finance flows, where to increase the opportunities for people who are perhaps down at the end of the chain who might find it harder to see the wider opportunity, which is why I think it's lovely to hear this sort of story that you were sort of COP, then in Montreal, the lens changes, but fundamentally it's all connected. And so I think it's identifying those nodes of connection that's really critical.
Thank you, Hannah. And since we are talking about the sort of end of the chain, the servicing sector and the people that are involved in servicing this technology, I must ask Vaibhav to maybe talk to the room and very briefly your work with the servicing industry in India. And also, are there lessons from that work, or are there lessons from talking to the servicing industry in India that you think applies generally to Global South that we could learn from and help, as Hannah was saying, help build into our future planning?
Great, yeah, thank you. That's a very important question, because when we did this work and we also presented, and this is a continuous work, and a lot of experts from the developing South were very interested, because the setup is so similar. And when I say the setup, it simply means that, well, large part of the servicing sector in all of these economies is informal. Informal means they are not like registered, trained technicians. Although the setup is so similar, so that's why the learnings are very, very transferable to each other. Now, I think there were different elements to this whole servicing game. One is, how does the consumer select a servicing technician? We have to understand the selection process itself, right? And we have done all these surveys of consumers also and technicians also. And very interesting learning that because there is no, like you could say, degree awarded, there is nothing, no certificate, right? So consumers generally go by this trust factor. So whatever my family or friend knows, it's a recommendation. Some family will say, this guy is dependable and trustworthy, go with it. No other way to that. So that's how this whole network kind of works. Now, once these people are selected also, what they're doing is pretty technical. I mean, you could get that trusted guy in the room, but you have no idea what this person is doing. And the season it's a very interesting business, because only when the peak summer starts suddenly, these people start getting so much demand, right? So the demand for servicing suddenly starts when the summer starts, right? So that is the big peak, right? And then these guys are in a lot of pressure, because they want to service as many households. That's where their money comes from, right? So then you don't know whether this guy is really doing the job the way it should be done, or right? So so the consumers also need to be aware. So the strategy that, after all of this research and all, the strategy that the ICAP adopts is, first of all, providing training, right? And training, the training architecture is not like the one-day training. That doesn't really mean much. That is okay, we are starting with that. But you have whatever way the technicians get trained, it is totally fine. The system will certify them. And the certification process should be a very robust process. So anybody who does not know actually good servicing practices, so GSPs as they are called in technical terms, any technician who does not know the GSPs actually should not be able to clear the exam, should fail the exam. And only if you have like a 20-25% failure rate, then people will be like, you have to really prepare for it. You have to understand the GSPs and all. The certification process is a very important part of this whole dynamics. Once they are certified, then there is also information that needs to go to the consumer that please hire technicians, only those who have got this certificate. So they are reliable. You know that they're reliable. And the final part is we also did a lot of theoretical analysis around it. But the bottom line of this is when in such a market, which is hugely informal, with no differentiation in services, the consumers will want to pay the lowest amount. So they don't want to pay $10 per servicing. They want to pay only $5. Because they don't know how good the technician is. So the market goes to the bottom, right? So now that is also very, very important. You train them, but consumers also have to be told that these guys should get some premium from you because they are much more reliable. So what we are trying is to create a system where you get a trained and certified person. The consumer also pays them, and they actually do a good. They are not in a rush. If they get a good money, they will not be in a rush to do as much as possible, right? So that is the process that we are trying to create a system essentially. And the system takes time. We're in the early stages, so the system takes time because the whole sector is growing so fast. But those are very important learnings. Think from a system perspective and think from many different angles: consumer angle, the company angle, the service technician angle, to actually create that system, in place. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Vaibhav. And what you told about this consumer trust in the word, the way they select their technicians is through it's word of mouth. That reminds me of a quick incident where, despite 2 Ivy League degrees and 15 years of work in this sector, when my parents, who live in India, decided to buy air conditioners for their when they were moving, they didn't talk to me. They actually talked to the service guy who their neighbor spoke greatly about. And I'm like, hello, you could have asked me. And this is, and they're like, yeah, this guy really knows the area and he really knows the local business. I'm like, okay, fine. So it's really true that people, that the way the consumers operate and the way the technicians operate is very different in the global south versus, say, in the United States, where I now live. And also see some of the same issues where the servicing sector is, the load is seasonal very much, and also they seem to operate in this black box where they come, do something, and leave, and you have no idea if there was, for example, venting of refrigerant that happened during that servicing incident. And you might think, why are we even talking about, this nerdy venting of refrigerant? And I think this is a good segue to move a little bit from air conditioning to other types of cooling. And we at EIA did an investigation, for example, that what we did was we went to several Walmarts around the DC area, and we found that these stores, and Walmart is a massive, massive company, were leaking majorly their HFCs that are in the cooling systems. And all of us think that we are going to bike to our local grocery store, take our tote bag, and we are being so good for the climate, buying the organic stuff. But you open the refrigerator and whoosh, you might have undone pretty much all of the climate benefits you thought you were gaining. So there's a real connection between the refrigerants that are coming out just because of how potent they are in terms of their climate warming impact and the overall climate mitigation opportunity available. And that's it. Since I have already shifted gears a little bit from air conditioning to the other type of cooling, which is refrigeration. And refrigeration is used both for cooling our food and, of course, cooling, increasingly, as we learned during COVID period, the importance for cooling vaccines and keeping our medicines safe. I want to talk a little bit about the refrigeration sector. And when I started working in this field, I thought that's a sector that's done. We don't have to do anything. So maybe, Philip, I'll ask you, especially in your work in different developing countries around the world, what challenges do you still see in the refrigeration sector? And where do you think is the most opportunity for climate mitigation there?
Yes, I mean, you said it's done. When Greenpeace and also GIZ was involved at that time, invented the first green refrigerator around 30 years ago, it took quite, it got big in China at the end, and it was Greenpeace ordering the first 70,000 units. And now we have a market share of 70% globally, so using isobutane R600NA. So, and if we look in the global south, domestic refrigeration, yes, I would say it's available, it's growing. The US is also soon, hopefully, introducing it. I mean, they have it, but it's going there, but there's always standard restrictions. So standards are very important that they allow this type of refrigerants. So this sector is pretty much done, yes. It's just a question of time, and it should be promoted that no more HFC and inefficient technology support. On a commercial side, small bottle cooler and so on, yes, we have the large breweries and soft drink companies that already switched to green technologies. But there's still a lot to be done when it comes to R290 hydrocarbons in that plug-in sector. It's coming, it's picking up, but we are at 10, 20, 30% of market share in the global south. So and it's a low-hanging fruit. So you're gaining access to cooling, but you're also gaining, you're saving electricity, you're saving cost, plus you're not harming the climate as much because the refrigerant is green. Then we talk about supermarkets, and supermarkets are growing like crazy, and the cold chain is getting more and more important, and supermarkets are in between. And there, yes, we still have a lot to do. And I mean, CO2 technologies or hydrocarbon plug-ins, semi-plug-ins, or cabinets, they are safe and centralized systems. But yes, there, I mean, when I went to Kenya, so I mean, I've worked in 30 countries currently, but I'm going a lot to Kenya and to Africa, but also to other countries. So I went this year, I talked to one supermarket, two supermarket chains, and I said, how many supermarkets do you have? 90. So how many will you have in 2 years? 200. I'm like, this is their goal. So supermarket sector is growing like crazy because also middle class is growing and whatever, and the shopping culture changes. You know, people like to go into a large store and not to the small grocery shop at the corner anymore because they have more income. So there I see a huge potential. Looking at, I mean, the last mile, and we always forget, the last mile, many people still do not have a refrigerator or a very inefficient old one with CFCs even. So there we have to look at, and I mean, there are innovative technologies. There are boxes like this, direct solar drive without a battery, a small panel. And these models exist where you can, they cost maybe $50, you know? It's a very small box. And there are different types also for small commercials. So these boxes have a SIM card in it, huh? And you pay for the service. So you get the box, you pay every day a few 50 cents, huh? And if you don't pay, the thing stops working. You have the GPS, so if you don't pay for a long time, people pick it up. And that's what I mean with combining digitalization, combining different payment models, combining new technologies, direct solar drive without batteries, having renewable energy. And I mean, this is where we have to move if we want to access the last, if the last mile wants to have access to cooling. Because we will not be able to have, I mean, grid. Yeah, we can have grid, but until we have grid in the last village, it will take some time, and they have a right to have access to refrigeration now.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's a really interesting point we're making. We keep talking about this growth in cooling demand, but often that seems to be focused on air conditioning or cooling space. And we forget that we're cooling people, we're cooling food that people need to be fresh, and that we're cooling vaccines, right? So it's not just the space that we are cooling. And one of the interesting things you mentioned is this difference between, you know, what's happened in the US versus what's happening globally, where we are seeing that there will be more and more refrigerators or supermarkets coming in the global south as we go forward because of rising demand. And in that, one thing I would say, again, having lived in the US, is that oftentimes when you go back and look, we don't have good models in the global north necessarily. I grew up in India back in the 90s with a refrigerator that had a refrigerant in it that was, you know, in terms of its global warming potential, so impact on climate, was between less than 5. And then I went to the US and found that every single refrigerator, I'm talking about domestic refrigerators, had gases in them that were hundreds to 1,000 times worse for the climate than what I grew up with in India with. And that was not a technology problem. When I tried talking to the industry there, they were like, oh, Americans need bigger fridges, and that's why we have a lot of food waste. But oops, we sell the same fridges in Europe. It was absolutely a policy problem and a safety standards and codes problem. So there is this sort of nexus between policy and technology, and it's not necessarily one way. We're not necessarily going from global north to south. There are lessons that we have from the global south that also go back, especially as you mentioned, and as we saw in the movie before, about decentralized cooling and all this innovation in cooling that really sort of go back. And that's a great segue for me to introduce our final panelist, Helen, who's here running from another panel and found us. Helen, would you introduce yourself? She's been, especially your role at TEEP, and also maybe understanding how in the TEEP, which she will explain what that is, have we been looking at some of these issues, particularly in developing countries, or in Montreal Protocol language, A5 countries, as we call them.
Thank you for inviting me. Sorry, I was at food loss and waste, and that is a big problem. Okay, do I need to just get closer? Okay. So my name is Helen Wilcher-Tirinoni, and I have the honor, the privilege to sit on the Technical and Economic Assessment Panel for the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol, TEEP, is a consensus body, so I may or may not be purveying their view here. I just, I would have to go back and check with everyone to find that out. So, and then I also am the Director of Global Climate Policy at Trane Technologies, which I don't want to do an advertisement for Trane, but I think it's, we have been a little bit undiscovered, and we are extremely committed to sustainability. So we'll just keep it there. Avispa, what do you want me to start with?
Maybe as the Technology and Economic Assessment Panel, what are some of the key challenges you've seen in developing countries as they're transitioning to new refrigeration or putting in new cooling in place?
So I think this transition is, the Montreal Protocol phase down to new refrigerants is very fast. It's too slow, but it's very fast. And there's a lot to do to prepare for this. So if I think about the non-A5 parties, the industry kind of was working for about 10 years to kind of develop technologies. Many of those technologies will be adopted in A5 or Global South and other in other countries. And I think that many of the lessons learned need to be transferred. And also we need to go backward and take the lessons from the Global South back to the Global North. And I can't not say this, Avispa, as I'm just so struck as I walk around this expo center with all the passive cooling. It's incredible. The design here with the billowing, covering, and the trees and the water and it's just absolutely brilliant. I mean, when I look also at places like in Nairobi, granted it's a very high level above sea level, so maybe it doesn't get quite as hot, but buildings with open spaces, just very cleverly designed. And we need to do that everywhere, because from a grid perspective, it will become quite unaffordable quite quickly if we don't take advantage of those wonderful, very seemingly simple technologies, white roofs, and especially if we think about the heat island in cities. I think that it's just a question of equity that we work toward advancing those technologies. I think as well, the TEEP is a very report-focused body. We do a lot of research, paper research, collecting data around new refrigerants and the efficacy, how well they cool, and how well they can be used in different places. Some of the things that I think, and stop me if I'm going too long, but some of the things that I think that need to be transferred maybe in the other direction are all the learnings around safety standards, training. Somebody showed me a chart the other day, and they said, here's the difference between the installation of the current refrigerant and the new refrigerant. And it was just a little teeny table with just a handful of things, and many of them were the same, and a couple of them were different. And so I think when I think about those safety features, we need to be more aware of the safety requirements today. If you release a refrigerant, guess what? It's very cold. and you need to protect yourself from frostbite. That's going to be the same today or tomorrow. Some of the checking for leaks and so on, there'll be an additional step. So there are some very basic things. Sorry, too much detail on Avispa, but there's some very basic things that need to kind of informationally be transferred. I think from, we've been watching a conversation on Montreal Protocol around dumping, and I think that that's going to be very, very important. But let me stop talking and turn it back over to you, and then we can go back.
No worries. Thank you, Helen. And you've touched on so many important points. And I do want us to zoom out a little bit. So I'll ask one question to Vaibhav and then come back to Hannah. Since you mentioned passive cooling, and that's not something we had discussed very much here yet, Vaibhav, does the India Cooling Action Plan include passive cooling, and how does it sort of mainstream it into the policy process and the sort of system in the country as a whole?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very important issue. So it is there, first of all, in the ICAP. How do we implement that part is very complicated, because we're talking about very different kinds of actors, and especially real estate market. So a thing as simple as building design, let's say. Passive cooling is the next level. Let's say even if I want to do a building design that has better building materials, better like windows, that kind of, so that sunlight comes in and all that, and those kinds of things. What the expectation is that the price of an apartment goes up by 10% or so. That's the expectation if you do many of those kind of things. Now, in a very price-sensitive market, real estate guys don't want to do that. Don't want to invest in those kinds of things, right? And that is exactly the big challenge. How do you deal with them? How do you ensure that their business is not hit, because they will never move in that direction? So unless you have a strong policy support, right? And of course, even right now, let's say, what policy support are you talking about, right? Even that is not clear, because government cannot be paying that 10% extra. It cannot. So what is the policy support we're talking about? Those things are emerging. Their discussions are very initial stages. So building energy codes are there, which talk about many, many different things, but they have also not been made mandatory because of the real challenges that we know. Commercial buildings, they have been told that we are probably going to the mandatory direction. But the rapid growth that is happening in the developing economies, especially urbanization, the way it is happening and all that, we are not able to, the real estate sector is actually very, very complicated, right? And anything that is a more infrastructure focus, right? It's also about another technology I will probably mention, not about passive cooling problem, but just a district cooling.
Yeah.
The district cooling is another very interesting example, much more efficient, right? It's already there in many parts of the developed world. And it works fantastically if you have a urban setting where the density is very high. I mean, that is a perfect spot for having these district cooling kind of technologies, because the density of human population is higher. So you could have a setup which is able to cool so many people, as compared to a setting where everything is very dispersed, right? So the cost per unit goes down. So there are many benefits. It's still, as I said, it's like a creation of different infrastructure altogether, right? And traditional operators or businesses in this space have been thinking more unitary technology perspective, like ACs, and because that market is growing crazily, right? So great return on investment there. So how do you convert that investment pot from this unitary cooling kind of investment to this district cooling kind of setup is definitely a bit of a challenge. What we are increasingly thinking, I think at the COP level, the first day, India's Prime Minister announced the green credits. Green credits, right? It's very interesting. It's beyond carbon credits. So it's not just talking about carbon, it's talking about something else. And what we have been thinking about at CEEW, right? How do you, and in fact, India already has a green credit scheme, right? In which it lists a bunch of intervention areas, so to speak, right? Includes air pollution, biodiversity, many different areas. Building is one of the areas, right? So how would the green credits work in practice? So let's say this 10% differential I was talking about, right? The government is not going to give it, the consumers are not going to give it. Can you find a different way? Can the developed world, right? And this is also a channel of climate finance. Can the developed world say this through green credits now? And of course, you have to find operational modalities of how do you measure and all those kinds of things. We'll figure that out. But the larger idea is this differential, can somebody pay for it? And really ensure that our penetration of energy efficient buildings is not 0.1%. It goes to 10% in the next 10 years, just because you have taken care of that extra cost, right? So those are very interesting, innovative solutions that are emerging that will hopefully push a lot of these, building efficiency, district cooling, many of those things that are just because of their cost, initial cost or whatever we call it, it's very difficult for them to be pushed in the developing markets. They're very price sensitive. So those are the things that we are kind of thinking about. So it is there in the ICAP. Progress is very, very slow, but we want to find solutions for them.
Thank you. And you already touched on the question I was going to come to you with, and Helen mentioned it, and we've all been sort of dancing around it a little bit, which is, yes, the technology exists, but there's a financing issue, and there's this sort of north-south divide, if you may. And it seems really, kind of obsolete to be sitting here in 2023 at this COP and talking about this global south and north, and dialogue exchange one way and the technology exchange other way, and then finance separately, just to take us all back to the Montreal Protocol example. Again, the way financing works there is there's a centralized pot, and then different donor countries put money into that pot, and then that gets taken out and distributed down the chain for developing countries. So what I really want to ask you, and maybe take us out a little bit from this little world of, large world of refrigeration and heating, and tell us about some new ways in which these conversations are happening, both in terms of financing, but also in terms of, as Vaibhav already alluded to, finding sort of creative ways where technology already exists.
Well, firstly, it is an honour to be invited into the cooling world. I'm actually realising how fascinating it is. I think one of the things that seems really key is to, this does seem like quite a world where it's quite immersive, there's a lot of sort of technical expertise, and perhaps then the risk is that it ends up getting siloed from other initiatives that are happening elsewhere. There's some exciting things happening in the finance space, but if they're not connecting up and the dialogue's not happening, then they won't realise what the opportunity is. So I was really pleased you raised the financial aspect. So for example, HSBC in the UK incentivises its mortgages around energy efficiency in homes. So how do you take an example of that, which is in a market where actually retrofitting is the key thing? We're not going to be building loads of new housing stock. We need to retrofit our housing stock. But the challenge is nonetheless the same. So how do you take the solution that might work there, that encourages retrofitting and energy efficiency of old building stock, and then translate that to a different place? And so I also agree. I feel like the sort of global north, global south dialogue feels unhelpful, because this is a massive global challenge for everyone, and there are specific elements that are particular to different places, but actually we need to be looking at it as a whole. The reason why I think we're going wrong so often is because we lose context of the whole, and we get siloed and we get protectionist, and actually this transition finance, the really key thing is that it's flowing to the places that are going to need it the most urgently as well. And this is the key thing with climate adaptation, is the places that are needing it most urgently are broadly not the places that are responsible for the problem. I know it's oversimplistic, but broadly that's true. So actually, how do we focus on the urgency of adaptation, make sure that the transition finance is flowing there, rather than it actually receiving the tiniest portion of finance? I think it's some 10% of global finance flows are to those places that are going to need climate adaptation finance the fastest. So it's almost like where the mitigation efforts need to occur and the financial expenditure there does need to be in the more developed places, because they are the ones who've contributed the most. I come from a country that has contributed significantly historically, colonialism and so on, and all the legacy of that. So how do you focus the mitigation efforts there and then accelerate the urgency of adaptation in the places needed most? And it's not an either or in any circumstance. Adaptation and mitigation needs to occur in both contexts, but there's a balancing of that, and that we absolutely need to be looking at that as a whole. And I think the estimate in terms of green transition finance is that we need 4 to 6 trillion in transition finance globally. And I've been working with Aviva investors, and they're saying that the global financial architecture isn't equipped to do that kind of transition finance. We will need different ways of flowing finances, different incentives. So, something like the HSBC example that I gave, and I'm not saying that they're great in all regards, I just think that's an interesting, innovative example, is how do you populate these many bits of examples and take a step back and go, right, what are we seeing as patterns here? How do we see the whole? And how do we replicate exciting things that are happening here but might not be entirely suited to that context? But how can we take the kernel of the same idea and adapt it? So I think this kind of holistic view is critical.
Thank you so much. Easy peasy, huh?
Yes, no big deal. It's just 6 trillion. And
just
we
6 trillion.
Shift the flows.
Well,
No
that's a great question then to put Helen on spot, since she wasn't here from the beginning. And then I promise I'll open it up back to the audience. I can keep asking questions till kingdom come, but I will ask one more and then it's back to the audience, or it was open to the audience. Helen, I would ask you to remove your TEEP hat and maybe wear your trained technologies, the private sector hat. As an environmental activist, the moment she says finance and the challenges with finance, I cannot help but think, what's the private sector doing? Yeah. You know, they're part of the effing problem. Where are they going to be part of the solution? And tell us some creative ways in which maybe you're dealing with that in your company, but it doesn't have to be at all in your company. Do you see some more sort of action in the industry overall, or do you not see it enough? So I'll open that to you.
Thank you for this question. First, I want to tell you the most exciting two things from this COP for me. Now you gave me a third one, and I'll tell you what it is. Was the passive cooling, which we just absolutely have to adopt everywhere, and the second was a story from Ghana around a program where they, if somebody has a check deposited in a bank, they will let them, purchase a new, more efficient appliance, so air conditioning or refrigeration or what have you. It's not stuff that my company makes probably, it's probably smaller than that. But and then they just kind of pay over time. And that is energy efficient, 0% interest. When the loan is repaid, it's gonna be a loan for another family. That is gonna be energy efficiency savings for that family to do more with. And I was really excited, and they have replicated that 4,000 times for 4,000 families. And I love that model. And if I take that back to maybe the US, I mean, we are so fortunate. The Inflation Reduction Act has just been, is moving forward. But one of the pieces of that act that's similar to that I am the most excited about is that they have created a loan program for families with low income, not only to replace their equipment with more efficient equipment, but also to kind of upgrade their homes and reduce the load there. So maybe you have holes in your wall, maybe you don't have any insulation. Quick story, when my mom moved in with us into a new room that we built for her, they forgot to insulate the ceiling, and it doubled our energy costs. Now, I can afford that, but I really don't want to spend my money that way. But what about a family that can't, right? That's not great, right? So those are a couple things. I love this story about, a lot of, and I'm sorry to like global north-south it, but like it's a lot new construction in the south and a lot old, stuff that needs to get fixed in the north. So like the loan program that you just described, I'm filing that one away. If you want a mortgage, we're going to upgrade your house. And I'm just thinking, do we take some money and put it in the kitty for that family, right? We actually, so this is something that my company does. We actually, for commercial buildings, have an energy services program. So we will go into an existing building, we'll assess it, we'll do a deep retrofit of it, from lighting to equipment to renewable energy on site to thermal energy storage to whatever it is that the building owner wants and needs. We will do that, and then we're bearing the capital upfront cost, and then then it's kind of paying itself off over time. So for commercial buildings, that can be an option as well. I think as well. Just lastly, I mean, you touched on this. I think building codes. That's really critical, and I think everywhere in the world we need to kind of get that package of codes that's needed. Those requirements, passive energy, lighting, insulation, et cetera. We need to get all that kind of together in a package and just socialize that everywhere. And it's tedious and not easy of IPSA, but I think it's really important.
Thank you. I have lots of follow-up questions, but I promised that I will open it up to the audience. So any questions? Yes, please. Please introduce yourself as well.
Hey, my name is Sebastian Koth. Maybe I raised my hand too quick. I'm still kind of trying to order my thoughts. But thank you, first of all, for that great insight into your work. I do research on the side of mechanical cooling in buildings, so I can really only talk from that side, not refrigeration. But one thing that I felt came a little short and that I would like your opinion on is we talk a lot about efficiency in terms of air conditioning, not so much sufficiency in terms of kind of what's enough. And I think one important distinction that we try to make always is between thermal health and thermal comfort. Right? And so I think, I'm from the US, I live in Germany now and do research there, so two places that have a lot of AC and are starting to include a lot of AC. In places where we don't necessarily need that, we're building glass towers in Alaska and California, two places that we don't need glass towers in, right? So my question, I think, also is this kind of 70% AC demand growth over the next couple of years in a lot of places is super, super important. But in a lot of places, it's really not, right? And so, like, how can we also make that distinction really clearly, either in building codes or in this kind of perceived manner of communicating that, you know, maybe a glass tower in Alaska or in California is not the right approach, and that we really need to think, like you said in the beginning too, about passive measures of going, where can we already do a lot just through construction, through architecture, and where is it absolutely necessary? Where do we focus that energy on? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I have so much I can yell about. For example, I live in the United States, and do you know that you can't take liberty away and people want to decide their own life and their own comfort? And whereas when I'm in China or in many places in India now, they're sort of regulating, and this is happening in many other places in the world, they're regulating what is the minimum your AC can even go to. And does that infringe on individual freedom? So, but as a moderator, I can skip, I can like take a step back and not yell into the void and maybe pass it on to our panelists. Maybe I'll start with you, Philip, and then pass it on to Vaibhav, and unless others also want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right, and there we have to see, and I believe, yeah, we should, I mean, some countries are able to regulate, especially in the public sector, the minimum temperature, I mean, but also, I mean, in India, for example, they decided when you turn on the AC, it starts with 24 degrees. And then you need to go down, but I mean, I would definitely say, look, 16, 18, whatever degrees is not healthy, huh? And therefore there should be a limit. And you could, but yes, there's consumer freedom, and if I want to have it 16, then I'm allowed to have it for 16 degrees. But so there we have to work regulation again, building codes, regulation, but awareness also, huh? And policy in the public sector. I mean, I think it was also India, but also in Italy and so on, they decided, hey, in the public sector, this is the temperature, you're not allowed, and this saves a lot. And if the consumer, and again I come with digitalization, if I'm the user of the air conditioner and I see on my phone, oh, I'm using much more electricity, and I'm getting the recommendation, hey, if you go from 20 to 21, you save 18% energy or 10% energy and cost, and either, you know, I get this kind of smart connection and recommendations on energy efficiency saving plus awareness. I mean, most people don't know, and there I think we have to work on various areas to reach that.
Before I hand it over to Vaibhav, I will be a little bit contrarian and say that maybe this is in many ways a first world problem. In India and in many other countries in the global south, what I have noticed living in Vietnam, living in Thailand, is that if you're a household, most likely your air conditioner is not running the whole time. You don't need an app. You're only turning it on when you're like very hot. Ask me with my parents, they don't let me turn on the freaking AC even like at 45 degrees Celsius in India. They're like, yeah, just, you know, wear shorts or something. So it's really also, I would say, like, how do you approach it and where you are? But I think the question you've asked is actually maybe broader than just the air conditioning temperature or turning off the air conditioner. Of course, not to take away from the point of digitization, but in many places, maybe digitization is not even needed. People know that they have to be efficient. People know they don't want to waste a single dollar on their electric bill. So in that context, maybe just to open that back up to you, Vaibhav, what do you think is the, how do we approach that sort of broader question?
Yeah, thank you. Very, very important question. And the contexts do matter. We have very, very different context that we're talking about. Also, what is the problem that we're talking about? The problem of glass buildings is very different from the problem of people running ACs on 21 degrees. And different kinds of interventions. Maybe at that building level, it's only regulation that can come in. And many of the places you have hard regulations. So it's a very simple, I mean, the only thing the government needs to say that glass buildings, and this is like the percentage of glass in the building material, beyond it is not allowed. Something like that. And it's a very simple regulation. We have to understand why the governments are not doing it. That is also important. I mean, is there some scientific information missing? Is the kind of stakeholder agreement on this particular issue, is that missing? There might be, we need to talk to industry guys also. I mean, there must be a reason why they're doing it in the first place. So one has to understand a lot of aspects and then figure out the regulation, but that is from the regulatory point of view. The other from the individual point of view. A great example is the Government of India started this whole debate on something called LIFE. LIFE is a lifestyle for the environment. And the acronym is LIFE, right? And that's what they've been talking about all around now, which exactly is this. And under LIFE, we are doing all of these programs which are, as said already, that run your AC at 24 degrees, but run it with a fan, right? And we don't want you to run your ACs in 21 degrees, wear a short, it's like there's also a part dependency of lifestyle, and that is so important for us to understand. There's a part dependency of lifestyle. If you're fixed into a particular thing, right? If you're fixed into using ACs, it's very difficult to get back to a non-AC kind of lifestyle, even if it is comfortable. We just won't find it comfortable because we have started experiencing something has changed in our life, So the part dependency is a very critical thing to stop, because if you get into that, getting you back is very, very difficult, right? So even to get, and that's why in developing world, and the big challenge is we are entering into that part dependency. Yeah. So before you actually enter and embed yourself, you rather intervene and stop it right there. And that's why these interventions about life and all are just trying to say, before we explode in that direction, we'll just stop it in its kind of, initial tracks and all that. So that's how I'll put it, but the question is very important. Yeah.
Hannah, would you like to add something?
I think it's an incredibly important question. Thank you. And I think I saw a stat the other day that if all of the people currently alive consumed at the rate of resource consumption that the US does, we'd need 5 planets. And we reach Earth Overshoot Day in June. So there is fundamentally, whether we're talking about energy or whether we're talking about food or whether we're talking about the fibers that make our clothes, we have a consumption problem, and we have wildly inequitable consumption distribution around the world. There's all kinds of parts of the world that need to be able to have more access to the world's resources, and quite frankly, there's whole parts of the world where we need to look at our consumption models and work out how we reduce down our consumption, have more circular models, because I think you're quite right, we're sometimes making really foolish decisions, consumption decisions, because we think we have the luxury of being able to do so, but not seeing this whole picture. And underlying it all is that our relationship with our planet and the way we use resources is really problematic and wildly inequitable. So just wholehearted agreement for the sort of ethos behind the question.
I cannot not say anything to that, and I almost want to do claps and absolutely agree, exactly. Clearly we're not on a path to 1.5 degrees Celsius as a world, and clearly it's a lifestyle problem and the consumption problem. And as I said, I can yell into the void for a long time about that.
Can I add to that? I know that...
Yes, go ahead.
I
And
know
then
I
we
said
have one
that
more
you wanted to go
question.
to one
Yeah.
question, but I love this question. I think it's brilliant. I love your answers. I love that it's lifestyle. I love that it's awareness. And I just wonder if we all went home. And it's chilly enough in here for you all to wear a jacket. We could turn that down in here, and that's part of passive cooling. One of the guys who doesn't like wearing a jacket told me a few weeks ago, Ray. But I wanted to say, Avispa, if we all went home and told a kid, if a child, a teenager, if you can save enough money out of our energy bill to, then I will let you have that money. And I bet you if we educated kids on this, parents would come along.
That's a good point. And again, looking at you, I can't not think about industry. Sorry, I will give you a chance for the question. And I think a lot of this, thermal comfort or like sufficiency versus efficiency question, we are thinking about it as individuals because that's where a lot of the growth is, but it's also companies or office buildings. Yeah. If you go to New York City, the number of office buildings that have their lights on and the air conditioning running the entire time, including in universities, it is insanity to even think about that. And I wonder when we are thinking about like sustainability plans or when there are CEOs or business executives thinking about their net zero goals or sustainability goals, how can they be held more accountable? I've heard you say something that you do in your company that I've quite liked. Do you want to say it or should I?
Go ahead.
Which is connecting the actual salaries that your executive class gets paid based on the sustainability goals. And I think that is something maybe we need more of in the world to get these big sort of consumers also moving. And Did I get it right?
I can assure you it's not that cold in our offices.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if your salary depends on it. All right. The other question from the audience you said? There was none. You were just keeping me short.
Okay. So thank you for this intervention. I'm Edia Soumouane. I'm a researcher in France, and I'm working on global energy systems, trying to bring them towards sustainability. But my question will be, when we talk about cooling, and you mentioned it, it's not really the households. You have the company, you have government offices, and also even within the households, you have different levels and different level of revenues. So I hear the finance aspect, but instead of bringing private sector from outside, government could do something for the private sector inside, like large office spaces. You can measure and say every company having that threshold should be cooling efficient, or every house larger than 200 square meters could be, so there could be different segmentation instead of trying to create a microstructure that will collect the global finance and try to channel it and make it complicated. And so that would be my first question. The second part is also the informal sector in the global south. Because when you need someone to fix your air conditioning, you don't look for the certification. You just look for someone who knows and someone who knows where to find the refrigerant to do it within the next 2 days. And so all those certification and making sure that I'm not sure it will trickle down to the ground in the next 15 years, if I'm optimistic, between the building regulation, training, capacity building, we'll be doing that for 15 years. And so we'll be almost at 2050 to start. So that will be my practical questions for you. Thank you.
Philip, do you want to?
I can start and
yes.
maybe. Basically, I mean, we have to. I think a lot of regulation is and enforcement. We can have the best policy if we don't enforce, and guidelines. And yes, we need that many trillions, but let us start with what we already have. And there's a lot of public procurement. There's a lot of international agencies buying equipment, whatever. And what are they doing? They're not focusing on really sustainable equipment. And we don't have the public procurement guidelines in most of the countries on sustainable procurement. And we don't have the building codes that we need. And we don't have, I mean, there are some, but there's always a room to improve, and to make them more efficient, more sustainable, and I mean, and so I think, yes, you can give guidelines to companies, and yes, there are, I mean, some companies, they have banks or whatever, they have the money, but you need to give them the guidance at least, and that they know what to do, and that you say, hey, I mean, I like the idea, regulating household size, and then you have to do that, we're getting into micromanagement. So we have to be careful. But I believe there's a lot of money also for energy efficiency and so on, but we're not using it wisely. So on the second question, certification and all that, yes. I mean, I did a few side events already on energy efficiency, and the servicing and the certification of the technician is crucial, especially when we talk about the future generations of refrigerants that are flammable and so on. And usually, I mean, in Europe, you can't just buy refrigerant, you need to be licensed. And we need to make sure that the informal sector can't just buy flammable refrigerant and then is going out there and is not certified and trained. So you need to have a licensing scheme, a certification scheme, a registration scheme to make sure that but we also need to include the informal sector and make sure that they get the training they need and the certification and they are part of the system. And I mean, I'm currently working on a methodology for the servicing sector, because I say one technician can save millions or thousands of tons, so he should get rewarded, and he needs the tools and so on. So it's crucial, but bringing that together, but then we have the user and the awareness. Huh? I mean, we can have the most efficient building. If you leave the doors open, it really doesn't matter. And even here, you walk around and says, please close the door, and the doors are open. And thousands of people walking in and out, and nobody cares. Or the temperature is too cold, you know, or whatever. I mean...
Yeah, I was walking outside the Saudi pavilion, and I was like, oh, this is amazing. And then like, oh, it's not for the climate, sorry. I moved along. Vaibhav, would you want to add something?
Sure. So I think the question, the first question I would ask is, can we do without it on the certification thing? Right? I think that's how we need it. Can we do without it? And I think the answer would be no, we cannot do without it. It is something important, it has to be done, right? And then the question comes about how do we kind of speed up the process, right? And because the challenge is real, right? If the government is serious and if it makes it a priority, it will not take 15 years, not at all. It will not take more than 3 years, but only if the government makes it a priority, right? And that is where the big challenge is, because there are many competing priorities, right? So think about the environment ministry, like whichever skill development ministry. AC, air conditioning servicing is one of the sectors they are working with. They are thinking about the whole larger economy, so many sectors that they have to deal with, so right? And it's for us also. We are dealing with so many things. So it simply means we have collectively failed to not, make it a priority on their list, because we are also working on so many things, right? So yes, of course, that's where advocacy, activism, campaigning becomes so important. Because that kind of makes that issue kind of a priority issue through a structured approach, right? But yes, it's something that we cannot do without. That is also very clear. And making it a priority, whichever way possible, we have to figure out a way. But if the government makes it a priority, government is so powerful in terms of its infrastructure it has. It always, irrespective of the whether global south or global north, governments are always very powerful. If you are able to convince them, they will deliver.
I believe there's one more question.
No? Can I tell you that, sorry, I keep doing this to you. At my company, we look for people that are not the usual suspects for technicians. So women, people that have left the workforce and are coming back in. We have various programs with a lot of different people. And what we find everywhere in the world, technicians' turnover is very fast. So we have to do our training in a different way and think about it in a different way. We have to think about people that are remote on islands that don't have access to nice training centers. We've got to think about this all collectively differently, and not be disappointed when these upskilled professionals move on to another career. Wonderful. We're going to train the next person right behind you, and they're going to move on to a better career. So I just wanted to kind of make mention of that, Avispa. We all have to do this better.
I think that's a great point, yes. We, right here, we have a picture of a woman fixing an air conditioner, and somebody was like, that's very interesting. I've never seen one. Like, well, maybe you're not looking. And that's changing. And you're right, the face of the servicing sector is changing, and it has to be as diverse as the people we are servicing. So thank you for bringing that point. I think we have one last question, and then I know we have a paucity of time, so we will have some closing questions, and then we will talk in the corridors. So
I'm Kalaivanan. I'm a master's student in sustainable energy, studying sustainable energy. So I have a question. How can we bring more recognition for technicians and also, let's say, people who are actually recruiting the technicians, how can we bring them more benefits through, let's say, green credits, carbon credits, or give them monetary benefits? How do we educate people that when you do this, you get rewarded? I think a reward function system actually makes people do things. So what kind of reward function system do you think is the best idea?
That's a great question. I wonder who wants to take it. You would, Philip, Heike, and then Vaibhav.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned carbon credits. We have some carbon finance projects now for green air conditioners, R290 super efficient air conditioners. And there, yes, we have to, I mean, we also rewarding the technician that they, first of all, I mean, usually, and that's what in India, Godrej did, they sold the unit only with free installation, first of all. Plus the user, the end consumer was advised that he needs a frequent service. And this is very important for the efficiency. So how to reward the technician? I just mentioned that we need a methodology for the servicing sector. Because if we train a technician, we mitigate that many tons, but we don't get any finance for that. But the technician needs to get rewarded that he has the time. And I mean, the consumer, we heard, doesn't always want to pay it, but he also needs the awareness. And I mean, we're talking about tools that are missing and I mean, recovery cylinders and collection schemes. So rewarding the technician that he's recovering the old refrigerant and bringing it to but he won't do it free of charge, So you need to give him a few dollars for it. And you need to make sure, so under carbon finance, yes, we are currently developing this kind of methodologies, but to make sure that at the end, I mean, we heard it, if we do not focusing on the servicing sector, we will not be able to have sustainable cooling.
And before I pass on to Vaibhav, I would say that the thought that often comes to our mind as the environmental investigation agencies, how can we build more of an extended producer responsibility where the incentive for collecting this and giving it back goes back to the same people who created this. So polluter pays kind of principle. But Vaibhav,
Sure. Thank you. So first of all, carbon credits are interesting, and I also lead the carbon markets work at CEEW, but they're also complicated. They are probably not answers to everything, right? So getting carbon credits to workers is, of course, one idea which needs to be explored. But the larger question is how do you, make some very important benefits available to this community so that they're invested, right? So carbon credits is probably not that. So what we have suggested and what is already being considered is things like health insurance, life insurance, low-cost loans. So if you create a community, let's say if you have a online registry of all the service technicians, and they are kind of trained in some way and all that, then they are covered through a kind of an health insurance scheme. Not by the general government insurance, which is anyways there, but something additional for them. Same for life insurance. And you make low-cost loans available to them, because now it's a community. So they're extremely important benefits. But of course, it is not carbon credits. Carbon credits, I don't want to think about carbon credits for everything, but other kinds of benefits, they're very, very practical and they're very effective.
Thank you so much, Vaibhav. And I know we've had a robust discussion and we can keep continuing, but I would like to give every panelist exactly 30 seconds or less to answer the question that we started with in this event. So we have to cool a warming world, and there are challenges and opportunities. We talked a lot about the challenges. I would like you to say that one opportunity in the global south that you think is sort of the biggest one. I'll start from that end of the table.
I just think that we need to work together to share information. The technologies are here. We can do this. We need to share information. We need to put policies in place, building codes, etc. So that's enough, right? Okay.
Thank you. Vaibhav?
I think the larger framing would be it's a great development opportunity, and within that, two things. One is access. We can get access to many people. And second, it's a tremendous manufacturing opportunity for India. Tremendous. So I think those are the two that we need to focus on.
Good job getting two in 30 seconds. Philip?
I would say policy. I mean, we have to do more policy. In Europe, we are now not phasing down, we're phasing out certain HFCs. And that pushes the sector and the industry. So more policy and more training for the technicians and certification to make sure we can install the sustainable technology.
Thank you. And Hannah, you get extra time because you didn't take it for the last few questions.
In which case I have 3, but done really quickly. Remember the why. It's a human reason to the why. It's challenge on sufficiency. I think that's a great point. And then finally, it's kind of connecting the whole system. Policy, finance, private sector, consumer.
Amazing. You just tied up the whole session for us. So thank you so very much for being in this panel with us. And thank you for the audience for sticking through to a very wonky discussion. And if I can please request the panel to stay back 1 minute for a picture. We'll take one here and then maybe we'll go stand up and then take one there. So thank you, everyone.